Okay. Hey guys, quick announcement for folks who got here early. If you whip out your phone, yeah, we're going to be talking a lot about phones tonight, but if you whip out your phone and do the QR code, you can download all of the slides to your device if you'd like to keep them there and follow along that way, or have them as a reference.
Got me? Welcome, everybody. Wave at me if you're awake. Okay. My name is Jenny Larisha, and I am the Director of Congregational Care here at Bay Pres. And part of what I do is I oversee care for our families. We have several support groups. We have Grief Share. We have In the Wildflowers, which is helping women with sexual trauma. We have a cancer support group, Healing Hearts and Minds for those who have mental health issues, and special needs parenting. I'm really excited to share with you that after tonight, we are initiating a support group for parents and grandparents who have children and teens and young adults that struggle with anxiety. So on the pews, you will find there's a contact card, and that's for us to be able to follow up with you if you want to be included in that. So I just want to give you guys a warm welcome. We are really glad you're here. And let me introduce to you our very special speaker. Dr. Steve Grcevich is a child and adolescent psychologist with over 40 years of experience as a clinician, researcher, and professor. A graduate of Northeast Ohio Medical University, he trained at the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western University Hospitals, later serving as an associate professor of psychiatry at NeoMed. For 33 years, he led Family Center by the Falls, a multidisciplinary practice caring for children and families, and his research has focused on the safety and effectiveness of medications for ADHD, anxiety, depression, and mood disorders. He's a recipient of NAMI's Exemplary Psychiatrist Award and participated in the 2019 White House Summit on Mental Health. In the late 1990s, while serving on session here at Bay Pres, Dr. Grcevich recognized the challenges that families faced when raising children with disabilities, and he co-founded Key Ministry with then Senior Pastor Hugh Auburn. Key Ministry now equips more than 3,500 churches annually and hosts the largest disability conference in North America. This conference has a special focus on families of children with hidden disabilities. He's the author of Mental Health and the Church and is widely sought after as a speaker and resource creator for national organizations, including the American Association of Christian Counselors, the Colson Center, and the National Association of Evangelicals. He also serves on Focus of the Family's Physician Resource Council. That's a lot of fancy words to tell you that he's a great guy. And he's here to share with us some really important information. So let's give Dr. Steve a round of applause.
Jenny, thanks for the very kind introduction, and Pastor Matt and the rest of the crew here at BPC, thanks for welcoming me back. Quick show of hands. How many of you here tonight would consider Bay Pres your church home? Okay, pretty good. How many of you have read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation? Okay, so that, for those of you who've been through the book, some of this is going to be familiar. For those of you who haven't, we're going to do a deep dive into some of his observations, some of the things that he recommended, and I'm going to go ahead and augment some of this with like newer research and other stuff that has come out since the book was published, along with some other things that he's been working on and speaking on as he's been asked increasingly to address this topic. So this is gonna, this is gonna be drinking out of a fire hose for the next hour or so. And so what I wanna accomplish, like in our time together, would be to look at some of the key hypotheses from Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, explaining why we're experiencing a youth mental health crisis. We're going to look at some of his suggestions in terms of managing technology and parenting practices, and look specifically at how parents through schools, through churches, are able to connect and take collective action, because one of the challenges in dealing particularly with his recommendation around technology is that one of the things I learn with my patients is they're quite attached to their cell phones and their devices. And if you as an individual parent try to take technology away from your kids, there's a good possibility nowadays that they're going to end up as social lepers. So that to do some of the things that the research suggests might be helpful for our kids and might help promote positive development, positive mental health. One of the things that's critical is parents and families working together on tackling some of these issues. I do want to take a minute before I get started to talk about why I retired. And one of the things about doing a talk like this is that I closed my practice about 3 months ago, and how can you in good conscience sort of like walk away when there are so many kids and families in need? And the reason why I did that is that there's actually a larger need that a lot of folks don't recognize. It turns out that families impacted by disability, primarily families impacted by mental illness, are probably the largest underchurched population these days in North America. Because when you have kids with these issues, it makes a profound difference in terms of your family's ability to attend church. And so when we do key ministry stuff, this is one of the slides that we share. And this was a study involving 3 different waves of the National Children's Health Survey with over 250,000 families. And what they were looking at was the correlation between having a child in the home and family church attendance. And so, to no one's surprise, and Bay Press has a nationally renowned disability ministry. If a family has a child with autism, it decreases their likelihood of setting foot in a church by 84%. But it's 73% if you have a kid with depression. It's 55% if you have a kid with a disruptive behavior disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. It's 45% if you have a kid with an anxiety disorder, and as you're about to find in a couple of minutes, that 20% of teenage girls have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders. And it's around 20% if you have a kid with ADD or ADHD. Now, lest we think that this is only a problem for kids, well, we have less data in adults. If you look at the work that was done in the Baylor study of religion, adults with significant symptoms of anxiety or depression are somewhere between 50 to 60% less likely on any given Sunday to attend a church service compared to their neighbors. So that one of the reasons why this is such a big problem, and one of the reasons why I retired 3 months ago to volunteer full-time to lead key ministry, is that ultimately, introducing kids and families to Jesus is more important than anything else that I can do. And I'm hopeful that through efforts of Bay Press, doing events like this, increasing awareness, and through mobilizing all of you, that we're going to be able to put a significant dent in this problem. Now, this quote on the screen, if I was going to pick one sentence to summarize Dr. Haidt's book, here it is. That basically his central claim in the book is that there are 2 trends. One is, overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world is the primary reason why kids born after 1995, or what he defines as Gen Z, became the anxious generation. Now, there are four fundamental, foundational reforms that he talked about in the book. The first three are the ones that you've probably heard about if you've seen any coverage of this in the media. One recommendation is that kids shouldn't get smartphones before high school. Basic phones where they can, make phone calls, text, that's okay, but no internet browser. No social media for kids before the age of 16. Phone-free schools was one of his recommendations, and I know that we allegedly have a law that they passed in Ohio about that, but I talked to some teachers before the program tonight, and apparently that isn't exactly the case out in the real world. And then the fourth one, and the one that I think that those of you who are here tonight as parents are going to feel the most uncomfortable with, is some of his recommendations about promoting play and particularly encouraging kids to be independent, which again is something I think that some of you, when I talk about the specifics of what he describes, are going to have the hardest time accepting and swallowing. And so one of the other things that he has talked about is the notion that this is not something that families can address alone, and then the collective action is clearly necessary. Collective action at the government level to start, regulating, tech companies, social media companies in terms of kids' ability to access certain platforms at a very young age. And then collective action among parents. Again, working together so that their kids aren't bereft of friends when we start stripping them from the technology that so many of them depend upon to communicate one another. And this line in the book that he used to describe this is, if you delay giving your kid a smartphone, it makes it easier for other parents to do that. If you give your kid more independence, it makes it easier for other kids' parents to do so too. If you do it together with other families, it makes it easier still, and it makes it a lot more fun. Now, we're going to do, and again, that this is going to be sort of like a lightning round because I want to spend more time dwelling on the specifics of what he recommended. But how specifically are teens and young adults being impacted by all of this stuff? Now, when you look at these slides, and particularly the ones I'm going to be showing you in a minute, one of the things, or one of the landmarks that Haidt points to in the book is that around 2012 we hit a tipping point, because that was the year that half of all teenagers had a smartphone. I think it's around like 85 to 90% now. But when you start looking at some of the graphs that I'm going to show you, where we really started seeing pronounced changes in the mental health of our kids was after 2012. Now this first slide, what we're looking at here is that these are the most common mental and behavioral disorders in kids by age. So that collectively, if you look at the entire childhood population, roughly, ADHD and anxiety disorders are kind of tied for the top spot in terms of the most common mental health diagnosis in kids. It's ADHD in kids ages 12 and under, but as you can see from taking a look, at this chart with, again, like, the green bar being kids ages 13 to 17, orange, 6 to 11, and the blue being preschoolers. Starting during the school age years, but particularly during the teen years, there's been this huge spike reported over the last 10 or so years in anxiety. So this is this most recent data from 2023 National Children's Health Survey, looking at rates of anxiety. Between 2016 and 2023 alone, there's been a 61% increase in the number of kids diagnosed with anxiety. There's been a 45% increase in the number of kids diagnosed with depression. And again, like when you start taking a look at girls, 20% of teenage girls, around 12% of teenage boys have been diagnosed with anxiety. Now, this graph is looking specifically at anxiety prevalence by age. And there's another piece of this story that that I want to address tonight that Haidt didn't really talk about in the book, but was one of the things that started hitting home with me and like working with the kids that we had in our practice, especially during COVID. This anxiety crisis isn't just a kid issue. It's affecting adults too. So that, when you take a look on the screen, like the top line are anxiety rates, since 2008 for young adults between ages of 18 and 25. So that's up over 160%. Anxiety among 26 to 34-year-olds is up over 100%. Anxiety in folks ages 35 to 49 is up over 50%. And interestingly enough, rates of anxiety in folks 50 and over have slightly decreased over the last 15 years. So again, that in the same way that like our phones and our technology are making kids anxious, it's also having a really big impact on lots of parents. And so my take-home point, and one of the things that I'd observed during COVID is that we had a lot of families in our practice where their parents were in the medical community. And that part of how kids learn how to deal with anxiety is watching how their parents deal or cope with anxious or stressful situations. And so in some ways, this can like literally be contagious within a family. And so that, when you have parents who are focused on their technology, and in particular, we're going to talk about this in a couple of minutes. It's the news that people are getting through their devices and their phones that may be fueling a lot of this anxiety. So that one of the things you may need to think about as a parent is like, to turn off Fox News, turn off, MSNBC, because the same things that are affecting our kids are affecting all of us and affecting parents too. There's a major depression reported in teens. And I can tell you, if you go back like 15, 20 years, we were actually approached when they were doing like some of the FDA studies looking at like safety and effectiveness of antidepressants in kids. Turns out when you were doing a research study back then, kids who met like true research criteria for depression were really hard to find. It's not so hard to find anymore. I mean, that there's been a 140% spike in, rates of depression, like in, teen girls since 2010, and a 160% increase in teen boys, even though their overall rates, continue to be considerably lower than what you see in girls. Here's part of the research that helped Haidt with his hypothesis. This is a kid's risk of depression based upon the number of hours a day that they're engaged in social media use. And so that this comes from like the UK. And you notice here that like, particularly with girls, when they start getting north of about 2 hours of time spent every day on different social media platforms, TikTok, Instagram, happen to be two of the most popular. There tends to be a pronounced increase in their risk of depression. Again, less so in boys, but we're going to talk about that, in some detail, because they're a little different story in terms of how they get affected by all of this. Now, mental illness among college students. Any of you who, work on a college campus, have kids, like, older children who are attending college are probably aware of this. That there have been massive spikes, particularly in the last 10 years, in terms of kids in college approaching us for disability accommodations related to mental health issues. One way that technology has been of benefit is that in a lot of college towns, the need among the kids attending these colleges like far overwhelms the available supply of trained mental health professionals, especially like when you think about like Ohio and like, Oxford, Athens, Bowling Green, Kent, places like that. And so that part of the boom in like telepsychiatry and online mental health was fueled by the need to do something for all of these college students who are currently struggling. Now, Here's one that, and again, not to wander down too far this road, but particularly when we start thinking about, barriers to church attendance. One of the things that some folks have been looking at in the literature over the last several years is how is the whole political climate affecting this in terms of, not only fueling anxiety, but are there, are the division in our society and the issues that folks are struggling with is contributing somehow. And so there was a study 3 years ago where one of the things that they found was specifically the largest increase in symptoms of depression were among teen girls who come from politically progressive families. And that again, one of our historic, the things they always asked on the boards is that typically internalizing disorders, depression, anxiety, are 2 to 3 times more common in girls than they are in teen boys. And some of that has to do with like the endocrine changes that girls go through, and the exposure to estrogen of like certain areas of the brain during puberty. Well, it turns out that boys from politically progressive families have higher rates of depression than girls from more conservative families. And it turns out one of the things that they think is a big driver of this is news consumption through devices. So that, I'm here, I'm old. When I was growing up, I think CNN, and we had cable TV when I was like a senior in high school, but when I was growing up, like the extent of the news that we would be exposed to as a family was, 6:30, like after dinner, Walter Cronkite came on for 30 minutes. Well, it turns out kids are getting bombarded with this stuff through their phones and through the social media that they follow. And again, one of the theories behind this is when they started like looking at these political divisions, kids and grown-ups from progressive families consume far more news online, than those, from families that are more conservative. They're really fascinating. There's another study that just came out where they were looking at this issue in 20 to 29-year-old women, where they found that, among young women who identified as progressive, 46% of them had an established mental health diagnosis. 12% of them regularly attend church. Among young women who identify as conservative, 21% have a mental health diagnosis. Over 50% attend church each week. And so part of what they're looking at now and trying to tease out research-wise is there something about having like either a more conservative or a more Christian worldview that is protective against certain mental health challenges? Does it come back to like the work that we do at Key Ministry? Is it just that, when you have one of these issues, it becomes a lot harder to be able to go to church, and so as a result of the way that they sample, just the barriers to church attendance, cause them to be underrepresented? Are there specific social benefits associated with regularly coming to church that have positive benefits from a mental health standpoint? There's a guy named Harold Koenig at Duke. He's a psychiatrist at Duke. He's actually written about 300 papers on that subject. And so, interestingly enough, Jonathan Haidt's an atheist. If you follow Christianity Today, he was Russell Moore's guest last week on their podcast. And one of the things that Haidt's interested in is looking at this issue about church, as being, a place where, people experience community, social support, and looking at whether or not there's something different about our worldview that protects to a significant degree against these mental health issues. Here's the issue that Haidt wasn't allowed to bring up in the book because this is career-ending nowadays for any academician, here in the United States, in academic medicine, academic psychology, to raise as an issue. The role that technology has had in fueling the epic of gender dysphoria. So what you see on the screen is that this is a slide from the UK. And it's easy to collect data there because with the British Health Service, like everybody's health information is in the same computer system. So it's, you can get national statistics. If you go back and look around 2011, 2012, to this date, there is a 40-fold increase in the number of kids referred for treatment of gender dysphoria in the UK over just a 10-year period of time. I'm doing a talk week after next at Christian Alliance for Orphans on, for parents sort of talking about this issue of gender dysphoria. And I was going through updating my slides routinely, and I stumbled upon some data last week that was stunning. So if you look back at 2022, there were 300,000 kids in the United States who identified as transgender. It's over 730,000 now. And there's been a 240% increase in 3 years. What was also interesting is if you go back 3 years, this was to a significant degree a regional phenomena. So that, the more politically progressive states, the Northeast, the West Coast, Illinois, is where all these kids were living. The most recent data that they reported out last month, the rate is uniform everywhere. And the way in which kids learn about this stuff, the online groups that they get connected with, the social support that they experience, online is clearly the biggest driver of all of this stuff. I mean, in my first 25 years of practice, I had one kid who wrestled with this. It is now 1 in 30 13 to 17-year-olds in the United States who identify as trans. And now, we'll talk a little bit about the suicide epidemic. So that beginning about 1990, for 15 consecutive years, suicide rates in teenagers went down. Prozac was released in 1988. Zoloft was released in 1989. Around 2004, rates started to edge back up. And one of the theories around this at the time was that was when these black box warnings came out about antidepressant medicine potentially being a cause or putting kids more at risk of suicidal behavior. And the docs, particularly pediatricians, got a lot more conservative about prescribing. So there was a little bump, but again, if you look up here after 2010, the line takes off again. And suicide's now the second leading cause of death among, kids in America between the ages of 10 and 24. Next, only to motor vehicle accidents. Now, looking specifically at the issue of girls versus boys, one of the things that Haidt talks about in the book is that girls are a lot more affected than boys by visual social comparison, and they also tend to struggle more with perfectionism. And so what ends up happening is they get online, they start following, or they click on things on Instagram, they're clicking on these little videos on TikTok, and it starts feeding them more and more and more of whatever they express interest in, either on those platforms or, as many of you know, when you start seeing these strange ads showing up in your social media, if you're browsing on other sites. And so when you think about, girls going through sort of this sensitive period where they're exquisitely self-conscious, you have Instagram where you can compare yourself to all the other girls in your class based upon how many likes you're getting, and if you click on Sydney Sweeney or Khloe Kardashian, you start getting all of these Photoshop pictures, of young women who are impossibly attractive. That has a huge impact on girls. One of the other things that we see with girls is that there is emotions are somewhat contagious. And so that girls tend to convey or communicate and share their emotions and share their disorders with other girls. So that one of the things that we saw, especially like high schools and colleges with the whole trans thing, is that one girl would identify as trans and all of a sudden there were like 5 in a classroom, who would show up. And so that the more girls are immersed in social media, the more lonely and depressed they tend to get. Now, this was a Wall Street Journal expose a few years ago about like the internal data that Facebook and Instagram knew about this. And that despite their own internal research showing that this was harming kids' mental health, they continued to go ahead and do so. So there was this British study where 13% of teen girls who are using Instagram in the UK, and 6% of American users trace their desire to kill themselves directly to Instagram. 40% of Instagram users reported feeling unattractive, and that specific feeling was derived from the time that they were spending on the app. Now, when we look at boys, they're more of a mixed bag because they're not as affected by the social media, but they get into trouble for other reasons. There's actually some evidence, and so that boys adopt technology and get online at an earlier age, and it's primarily driven by the gaming that they do with one another. And that gaming, actually gives them some opportunity to be able to build agency, build, friendships. Like some of these games that they get involved in playing, like require collaboration. A little bit of this, like when it's under 2 hours a day, might actually have some benefit for boys. But again, the more that they get wrapped up in social media, the more of an issue it tends to be. And they also tend to be impacted in the same way, in that one of the things that we'd seen before in boys is that the most common diagnoses in the teen years, until the last few years, had been, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder. It's now depression and anxiety. The biggest issue that boys get into is with porn. We know that like 2/3 of guys, 39% of teen girls report having been exposed to it online. There's a range in some of these studies, but ballpark figure is that 1/3 of our teenagers are intentionally seeking this stuff out. And it's having really profound, effects on kids, that their entire schema or way of thinking about how you act, sexually is being influenced by this stuff. Haidt talks a little bit about 4 foundational harms of a phone-based childhood. He talks about sleep deprivation, social deprivation, attention fragmentation, which is another issue that he's focusing on now in his most current work, and propensity for addiction. So here's some statistics in terms of what percentage of our teens get less than 7 hours of sleep a night, and what has happened with that over the years. And that figure is selected because we know that when kids don't get enough sleep, they're prone and more at risk to a whole variety of mental health conditions. And I need to get better coordinating my left hand with my right hand so that you can see that. Now, here's one that I think is a stunner and explains a lot of this too. This is the daily time spent with friends by age group. And so if you go back 20 years ago, the typical older teen was spending 2 to 3 hours a day with friends. It's well under an hour and heading toward 30 minutes nowadays. When you start looking at, adults historically have spent a lot less time with friends than teenagers do. But even for adults, we're socializing with one another a lot less. Now, this would be the one thing about all of this technology that I would be most concerned about if I was a parent of a teen today that wasn't even on the radar when Haidt was writing the book. And this has to do with teens and their AI companions that they are seeking out online. 72% of teens in a study that came out 3 weeks ago have used AI companions at least once. And over half of them are using them regularly, defined as 3 or more times a month. And so that, where a lot of kids appear to be using this stuff is practicing social skills that they haven't otherwise acquired from interacting in the moment with other embodied persons and peers. And that among this, 52% who are heavy, AI companion users, a third of them talk to their AI companions about stuff that they choose not to or are uncomfortable talking about with a peer or an adult. And I know that there's a really prominent lawsuit about, a situation where a kid had one of these AI companions that basically talked the boy into killing himself. We don't know what's driving this technology, but this sure isn't healthy. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I did a podcast last month with Brian Dolan, who used to host the morning show on Moody Radio here in Cleveland. They now have Stained Glass Media and the Third Place podcast. If you want to do sort of a deeper dive in that, go ahead and check out the podcast. I also did a whole article on that for the Substack I do on child psychiatry for Christians. Haidt, and this is something he got into in the Russell Moore podcast that he did last week, was saying that one of the big challenges is what this stuff is doing for our capacity to be able to pay attention. And that we haven't seen sort of the epidemic of this yet in kids, but there's been an explosion of young adults, particularly young women, seeking out ADHD treatment. And for 12 to 18 months, as a result of this spike in the number of people looking for care, there were chronic shortages, and it was very difficult for families who had kids with ADHD to be able to find prescriptions. So that, we used to think about this as a kid, thing. 6% of our adult population now carries an ADHD diagnosis. There's been a 30% increase in the number of prescriptions written for adults in the last 5 years. There are now more adult women, percentage-wise, taking medicine for ADHD than there are school-age girls 10 and under. And so, the time that people are having to spend, we know that women are significantly more likely to attend and graduate from college. We look at the kind of jobs that they get. The amount of time that they're spending on screens is literally destroying their capacity to be able to focus and attend on stuff. I know one of the things that I learned about when I was writing the book that we did for churches on how to do mental health outreach and inclusion. One of the things you learn nowadays is that the publishers put very strict limits on the number of words an author can include in a book because people won't even pick up and try to read anything anymore that's too long. And so, looking at this, I did a talk last week specifically on the impacts of ADHD on spiritual development. Your capacity for attention is really essential, as a Christian, for the practices that, are associated with discipleship. You need to be able to attend to live a spiritually disciplined life. There's an article last month in Relevant Magazine talking about the impact of this on what worship's going to look like in 10 or 15 years. Because are people capable of even paying attention through a half an hour sermon? Are people capable of praying quietly for 5 minutes? Are they able, like, to read a chapter out of the Bible and, like, to be able to, to sort of ponder and reflect upon that and to draw significant meaning? All of this technology is eroding our kids' capacity and our capacity to be able to do all of that. Now, part of what Haidt emphasizes in the book is that, when you look at sort of like pre-2010, 2012 in particular, kids grew up in a world, of like real world relationships. That there were kids, adults, other people around them with bodies who they had to relate to. That communication, by and large, was synchronous in that it was taking place in real time and typically involved communicating like with one other person or with a small group of people. And that it took place within the context of fairly tight-knit communities where, that there was a high bar for getting in, there was a high bar for getting out. So you live with people you live with. You had the friend group that you had at school. And one of the things that you had to learn from this is to how to get along with other people. What happens in the virtual world is that a lot of our relationships are now disembodied. They're heavily asynchronous. You think about texting. People can take a while to respond to instant messages. People post stuff online and other people comment an hour, 2 hours, 6 hours later. So communication's heavily asynchronous. When kids get on these social media platforms, as opposed to talking to their friend or 2 or 3 other friends at the lunch table, they're broadcasting it out to everybody in school, potentially kids all over the United States, and the folks in China who are like following all of this stuff and collecting data. And there's a very low bar for entry and exit into those communities. And so, as a result, kids aren't learning essential relationship skills. And here's this quote up on the screen that Haidt had shared in the book, is that the key factor is the commitment that's required to make relationships work. Because like when people are raised in a community, that they can't easily escape, they do what our ancestors did, that they learn how to manage relationships, they learn how to manage themselves, and they learn how to manage their emotions in order to keep relationships going. When you start taking a look at the world that our teens inhabit and a lot of our adults inhabit, that's all being lost as, most of their lives have shifted to screens and online platforms. Now, here's where Haidt gets into like the importance of play, and I'm going to get into some of the parenting things that will make you uncomfortable. And so, play is really essential for kids because this is where they learn executive functioning. And when I talk about executive functioning, when I'm talking about like these higher order brain processes that allow you to exhibit self-control, to learn from your mistakes, to apply lessons learned in one situation to a similar situation, to self-regulate your emotions, to delay gratification, to manage time. And so, when little kids are playing, that cognitive capacity is developing, as they interact with the world and as they interact with one another. One of the things that Haidt talks about is that there is some physical risk that's important to this. Because one of the things that happens when kids play together is that they learn how to protect one another from those risks. And when we eliminate all of the risks, essentially our kids aren't immunized to the anxiety that's associated when you do need to take some risks. And that it's experience as opposed to information that's central to kids in terms of their emotional development. Now, Haidt uses the term experience blockers to refer to smartphones, tablets, and what he describes as paranoid parenting. And one of the reasons why these are experience blockers is he talks about the process of attunement. And this is basically like how a child or a teen learns to become aware of, understands, and learns to respond appropriately, to other people's emotional needs and their emotional states. And it's mastering attunement that provides the foundation, for your ability to self-regulate your emotions. And clearly, this happens through face-to-face physical interaction. The criticism that everybody had raised during COVID when they started sticking masks on little kids, the way that kids learn how to interact socially, is by picking up on body language, facial cues, facial expressions, and there's been a generation of kids that are deprived of that, but it's not the same when you're trying to interact online. I know like the last few years of my practice, it was divided between doing virtual visits and house calls. I did away with my office, and all of my in-person visits were in families' homes. And there were certain groups of kids, particularly kids on the autism spectrum, where I needed to do their visits in person to be able to pick up on some of the nonverbal social cues. So that, again, kids may be quote unquote talking face to face, but it's not the same from a neurodevelopmental standpoint as trying to do that in person. And so healthy brain development depends upon having the right experiences in the right sequence. And so that for this social emotional learning, there are certain critical periods during adolescence, and it's earlier for girls. It's 11 to 13 for girls, 14 to 16 for boys. Hence, this research is the underpinning of the recommendation that we don't let kids under the age of 16 have access to social media. So that, again, kids need to learn the art of friendship, and the art of friendship is embodied. One of the horrifying things about all of this, AI stuff is that it's all disembodied. One of the things, we actually brought this up at one of our disability conferences, is the importance for churches to be teaching into kids and, helping their parents to understand the theology of the bodies. Because bodies, the fact that Jesus suffered and died in bodily form, for our sins so that we could be saved. Bodies are really important, but bodies are absolutely essential, in terms of, kids learning the appropriate social skills, for interacting with one another. And so all of this time that they're spending on their screens doing the gaming takes away from their ability to learn these other essential skills. Haidt talks about this idea of anti-fragile kids. Part of how he got famous was his first book was called The Coddling of the American Mind. And again, he's a social psychology professor at NYU and was looking into this whole phenomena about college kids getting triggered by people who had different opinions than what they had. And he ended up interested in this youth mental health crisis because of the level of fragility that he was seeing in the college students who were coming to his classes. And so to promote anti-fragile kids, he emphasizes, risky play, is heavily critical of parents who practice what he refers to as safetyism. Because, he encourages kids to be, to be independent, and he encourages parents to encourage their kids and give them opportunities to learn how to deal with risk and conflict. And so I'll share two examples from his book that will scare the bejeebers out of all of you. But, so he teaches at NYU. He's got an apartment in the middle of Manhattan. His 12-year-old son became a big tennis fan and decided he wanted to go to a night match at the US Open. So, Haidt and his wife let their 12-year-old go online, buy a ticket, and navigate the New York subway system, alone, to go watch, an evening tennis match at Flushing Meadows, and then come back late at night. And it turned out the match ran late, and the connecting train he needed to go home was shut down. Well, spontaneously, without asking his parents, he got up on the street and he hailed a cab and he made it, the last mile home, from the subway station where he was dropped off. His apartment's, Haidt's apartment is a block and a half from campus. His wife let his 6-year-old daughter bring him lunch from home that involved crossing a busy intersection in New York City. So that, again, that part of what he's communicating here, is that, that fearful parenting or what, overprotective parenting, interferes with kids' ability to develop self-confidence. It interferes with their capacity for secure attachment. And part of this, how this is manifested in the digital age, is that, when kids got phones, parents got phones too. When when they finally could use iPhones on Verizon, everybody in my family got one. And the parents are using their phones to surveil their kids wherever they go. One manifestation of this is, they got Progress Book, all these online grade systems that, I looked at it whenever I was seeing kids because they were in my office because they had ADHD and were failing their classes in school. But there are parents who are literally monitoring and get a push notification every time their kid gets a grade or every time they turn homework in. And we wonder why kids have such a difficult time being able to adjust them, when they go away to college. The other place where promoting anti-fragile kids comes into play has to do with the development of 2 different neural pathways in the brain. Haidt talks about the behavioral activation system. And this is these are the pathways in your brain that this is the kid in the candy store. Being able to react and respond to opportunity. The ability to be able to think for yourself, to do things independently. But there's another competing system, the behavioral inhibition system. And this is what turns on, when threats are perceived, when a kid's in danger, and they kind of go into, defend mode. Well, this pathway's chronically turned on in kids and adults who have anxiety. And part of what you're trying to do, and when you look at evidence-based treatment for this in cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy works by trying to address the misperceptions that kids and adults develop over time and the way they misinterpret signals in their environment that fuel feelings of anxiety and fuel feelings of depression. One of the things he points out is that kids naturally will sort of seek out things that are a little edgy, and they look for opportunities to take risks. A big reference point in my practice is when I have my office, kids would come in, they're on medicine that may cause them to gain weight or lose weight. We measure their height and weight. The thing that they would get excited about is, when am I tall enough to get on every ride at Cedar Point? And so hitting the 54-inch mark for my kids was this was a big developmental landmark to them. And that one of the things that Haidt talks about specifically with playgrounds is that they should be, a risk of having minor injury should actually be a feature of the playground design. I was actually in a park today, because we have lots of shade trees and I want to get some sun this morning. And I was looking at the playground apparatus in the park. It's like Tim Misney was their consultant. There's no possible way, for a kid to get hurt on any of this stuff. And, for those of us of a certain age, well, remember the sliding boards in the park that were 10 or 12 feet high, and it was a little bit, scary, or the kids, the kids who are climbing on things. So kids will naturally seek that out. And when parents deprive them of the opportunity to do that, they don't develop the self-confidence that allows them to enter into other risky situations. Biggest example of this in terms of a struggle, and one of the things that I used as a marker with my older kids in the practice for anxiety is that they won't learn how to drive. Most kids, 15 and a half, drive me to the BMV and let me take the test. but I see increasing numbers of kids, and they may be better in a lot of different ways with their anxiety, but that specific problem is like the hardest one for us to kind of get them across the finish line. So, like, winding down, here's a specific advice that Haidt gave to parents of kids of different ages. So if you got a preschooler, kids 5 and under, lots of playtime, simple responsibilities around the house, and less and better experience on screens. So, like I tell kids in my practice, there's a reason why Steve Jobs didn't let his kids have iPads. Like, he knew. But with like really young kids, like, talking to grandma or grandpa over Zoom or FaceTime, talking to their cousins, spending time like talking to like maybe like a friend who had like moved away to another city or the neighborhood. As long as the communication is active and synchronous in real time, if a kid's going to be on screen, at least they're building like some language learning out of that, and a little bit of bonding. Suggest with like little kids limiting non-educational screen time to an hour during the week and 3 hours on weekends. No screens during meals or family outings, and no screens 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime. School-age kids. More and better time with parents, family, and friends doing things together. To promote independence, Haidt suggests like letting kids out of your sight without them having a way to reach you. So I know like when I was at this age, all the neighborhood kids would gather in like the 2 consecutive backyards that had a minimum number of trees, and we would all be playing football until like mom started like yelling out the front door, and the team started getting smaller because, kids were slipping away for dinner. So, if there's a playground down the street, if the kid wants to hang out in somebody else's yard, let them. Encourage sleepovers and don't micromanage them. One of the suggestions that Haidt made, and I think it might be somewhat suitable to like Bay Village. Like, where I live out in like Chagrin Falls, Bainbridge Township, everybody rides a bus to school. Haidt suggested that parents get together collectively, and even where you have bus transportation, or if that's an option, drive up to a drop-off point 5 minutes from school and let them walk the rest of the way with peers, so that they're having some peer interaction and conversation, some independence. After school time should be reserved for free play. He encourages families to go camping so that kids experience some of the challenges of, being outdoors and some of the risks that go away with that. Look for sleepaway camps with no devices where they're not excessively concerned about safety and will let kids have a certain degree of adventures. He talks about this notion of like, child-friendly neighborhoods and playborhoods, where, kids shouldn't be like spending all their time in the house in the middle of the day. And where this first struck me is that, like we live in a neighborhood out in Chagrin Falls that is like very kid-friendly. Day like today, middle of summer, sunny, 80 degrees. I drove through the entire neighborhood because I was enjoying my convertible at the time. I didn't see a single kid out playing in a development with 350 houses. And so getting kids outside, getting them around other people, and maybe for a little bit of time getting them, out from, the scrutiny of parents is important. Teenagers, he really pushes the idea of independence here. Increase their mobility. And one of the things I was really pleased to hear that the student ministry folks here are thinking about is creating like a third place in the church, where kids from the community can come and hang out and spend time with one another. Like let them access those kind of places. Rely more on your teen at home. Give them responsibilities. Encourage them to find a part-time job. One of the things that I saw a lot with kids in my practice is that they started using the devices as their coping mechanism for dealing with, their anxious thoughts. So that for kids who are prone to this, busy is better, it was an interesting phenomenon because a lot of my anxious kids, used to be like in the early days of my practice, the first 2 weeks after school let out, I could like lay by the pool and like catch up on all my reading. These guys crash and burn when they don't have stuff to distract themselves from their internal distress. So getting them busy with the job, getting them engaged in responsibilities is not only good in terms of helping them to build self-confidence, it's a more healthy coping mechanism for their anxiety than to distract themselves by watching YouTube videos. Find places and opportunities for them to nurture or to lead. I think about one of the things we encouraged our own daughter to do was to become a Sunday school teacher. She came home one day and said, "Dad, I'll give you $100 if you can come and teach my class next Sunday without whipping out your prescription pad." but that was a very helpful responsibility for her. Consider like a high school exchange student program, and have your kid go, to a different city or a different country to live with another family for a period of time. Not necessarily pushing kids directly into high school, but giving them a gap year program where they'll have rich experiences. Helping them develop good evening routines and with phones removed from the bedrooms at a set time. Again, like watch for problematic social media use. So here's this tech advice. And this is pretty much for all kids. No more than 2 hours a day on recreational screens. The average 8 to 12-year-old now spends 4 to 6 hours a day on screen. Devices need to be used in common areas of the house where adults can see what they're doing, and can control the content. So get the screens out of the bedrooms. Even a situation where kids need like a quiet place because, everybody's got Chromebooks and iPads that they're required to do their homework on these days. Try and create a quiet place, but in a common area at home because, oftentimes it's a technology that they're being issued from school where kids are accessing some of the stuff that they shouldn't be accessing online. No screens at the dinner table. No smartphones before high school. He encourages parents to learn how to use content filters and parental controls. And on the slide, there's a specific website that he recommends with step-by-step guidance, for parents looking to implement some of these controls. Coordinate tech limits with parents of your kids' friends. It would be a great idea, if your kid's involved with the student ministry here at the church, get to know the other parents, and look at what you can do collaboratively, so that, because the first thing they say, yeah, but Damien's allowed to play video games until midnight. Well, if you've had a conversation with Damien's parents, you might find that that's not the case. Focus more on maximizing their in-person activity and their sleep as opposed to the total screen hours. Because it's the in-person stuff that really allows them, to develop the social capacity that they need. Provide clear structure to the day and the week. You're watching for signs of addiction and problematic use. And that would be, when does this stuff start to interfere with your kids' ability to do the things that they need to be able to do? Are they underperforming their level of intelligence in school? Is it getting in the way of their capacity to make and keep friends? Is it getting in the way of their ability to function in an age-appropriate way as a member of your family? Is it getting in the way of them taking part in the typical kinds of extracurricular activities that are appropriate for kids of their age, here in Bay Village and on the west side? Don't let them open social media accounts until they're age 16. And Haidt is working with Congress. And this is actually one area where it seems like maybe the red team and the blue team can work together around, implementing laws. They've been doing this, I think, in Texas, where they found age verification systems to keep kids from getting access to porn. They're pushing on doing this with the major social media apps. And take time to have a conversation, with your kid and listen to what they think about it and, and try to come to sort of a good understanding of their reality. So here is collective actions in terms of community-based public policy stuff. Raise the age of adulthood to 16. Facilitate age verification. Get the phones out of the schools. I was talking to one of the teachers who was here like before we started. I got to guest teach, a few times, like, where our girls like went to high school. Even after they graduate, I got to know folks. And one of the things that shocked me was like, when I went to school, everybody piled out of class and they ran, they were talking to their friends. Guys who were with their girlfriends and they looked like GIs that just got back from like World War II. It's like, still be there in like 50 minutes. But kids don't interact with each other in the hallway at school anymore. Like class would let out, they've all got their earphones in and they're staring down at their phones and not talking to one another as they're walking down the hallway. That's the push for getting the phones out of the schools, because it's to promote social interaction while they're at school. Don't punish parents for giving kids real world freedom. Because people call in social services because a mom lets her 8-year-old kid go 2 blocks down the street and play alone, or play with other kids in the playground. Encourage more playtime at school, longer recess, open play periods before school, and free play clubs after school where kids can interact with other kids. Think about designing public spaces with kids in mind, and more opportunities for kids to pursue vocational education, and specifically like apprenticeship youth development. So that covers what Haidt had to say. I want to take a minute or two and talk about, my guess is that there's probably an overrepresentation here tonight of families who've had kids with issues. What do you do if your kid needs help? Because I did what I did for 40 years, and I don't think this has ever been a greater problem for Christian families than it is now, because of the cultural disconnect between our values and the values that are held by the vast preponderance of the mental health profession, and increasingly the vast preponderance of the pediatric profession. Actually wrote an article recently where I think the level of discomfort in the Christian community in terms of taking a kid to a pediatrician in 10 years is going to be worse than taking a kid to a mental health professional. And so the kids are vulnerable. We need to think long and hard about who's in a position to influence them. So that I would definitely start with recommendations from trusted people. And when we do mental health training for churches, we talk about the importance of vetting. And one of the services that a church can provide is, to have lists available for adults and also for children and adolescents in terms of recommended professionals, recommended facilities in the community when families need help. Because it's still statistically true that a family is more likely to approach their church for mental health help than they are a psychiatrist. And that the medical and the mental health professionals serving our kids should, at the very least, support the values and ethics that we as parents are seeking to impart to our kids. And so I'm not going to get into like all of these guidelines. I actually think that there are a couple of folks here tonight, like Denny, are you here? Okay. Yeah, so some of the people very quickly that I would recommend, if you have a kid who has a need in the area. Denny King's here tonight. Denny is a professor at Case Western Nursing School who trains nurse practitioners. While he was getting his doctorate, he was working as a biblical counselor at Fieldstone Counseling. And he is well trained and equipped to do a lot of the things that a psychiatrist would typically do. Liberty Fritzler is a child psychiatrist with an office in Hudson. Her practice takes insurance or takes a lot of different kinds of insurance for folks who need that. Kara Daly, who lives over here on the west side, she lives in Rocky River, has a practice called Daily Behavioral Health. She used to be on my ministry board. I'm on her ministry board. She tends to hire a preponderance of psychologists and counselors who are Christian. So if I were looking at like 3 places off the top of my head, if you're going to develop a list, I would do that. But again, talk to other trusted people, who've had good experiences. And so to kind of close with this, Haidt talked about this notion, when you think about sort of caring for your kids, Like how to be a better gardener, and how do we create space for them to learn and grow? Give your kids far more unsupervised free playtime. Delay their entry into the phone-based childhood for as long as you can. Coordinate with other parents so they're not the only kid without a smartphone in middle school. Increase their mobility, increase their independence, and consider the benefits of a quote-unquote free-range childhood. What I would add to what he had to say is that I think that parents need to start protecting kids against influences that are rotting their minds and rotting their souls. One of the benefits of being part of a church, and one of the things that my wife and I were really intentional about when our girls were of this age, and the value of being somewhere like here, is that we wanted them to have other adults in their life who they know could talk to and would reflect our values when stuff came up that they didn't feel comfortable talking to mom about. And that's a fair amount of stuff in my house. So you want to surround them with other people who reflect the values that you're trying to impart. Get yourself off your phone, because be the difference, be the example you want to set for your kids. Get off your phone, stop consuming so much news, and then get your kids off the phones, and give them role models who demonstrate virtue. As I've gotten into more stuff and gotten older, especially with the whole trans thing, there's a tremendous value to biblical anthropology. And the further that we get from sort of the family model, and the model in which children are raised that's described in the scripture, the more mental health problems we seem to get into. And so I would encourage you all to go back and or you can look at it if you're browsing on your phone right now. Deuteronomy 6 in Bible Gateway. And the description there about how raising kids in the faith and communicating the faith was a community responsibility coming around and coming alongside families. And again, that there's some really good people here, and so if you don't have a church, I would trust the folks leading here, to give you the kind of community, the kind of community of faith that you want your kids to grow up in. So, take-home points. Overprotection in the real world and a lack of protection in the virtual world, according to Haidt, are the principal contributors to our mental health crisis. The 4 foundational harms that kids are exposed to in our current culture: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. Collective action, at the family level, the school level, the church level, the community level, state level, federal level, are necessary to address these foundational harms. And I like this final quote of Haidt's. If you delay giving your kid a smartphone, it makes it easier for other parents to do so. If you give your child more independence, it makes it easier for other parents to do so. If you do it together with other families, it will make it easier still and more fun. And one final point before I close and take some questions. And this is how you can track me down if you're interested in anything thereafter. Everybody here, statistically, if you look back at that slide that I showed at the beginning of the program, knows somebody who has been impacted by this mental health crisis. You have friends, you have neighbors, you have coworkers. I mean, it's pretty much a statistical impossibility if you look at how common these problems have become. If they have a kid who's struggling with emotional or behavioral issues and they're not part of a church, invite them to come here. Bring them with you on a Sunday morning. Jenny's assembled a team here at the church in terms of care and support, to help come alongside individuals and families who are having these struggles. This church held a national mental health ministry conference last fall with 30 speakers from organizations all over the country that are trying to tackle this stuff. There might be one church in America that is more networked, connected, and resourced to do something about this and to welcome families. And maybe that's Saddleback. But this church has every resource available to it, to be a welcoming place, and and a place where too many of these families who are outside of the church, can come and can get to know Jesus, and grow in faith in him, and to do that in community with other people. And so Beth Golick, who is our disability engagement director and my partner in crime, for a little bit of her time at Key Ministry, is available. So if you know of families that you would like to invite to church, but because of some sort of anxiety issue, other issue, behavior issue, emotion issue, they might need a little extra support, I would encourage you to reach out to Beth if you don't know her. It's bgolick@baypress.org. But one of the things I would really hope would come out of this is that, with this increased awareness, that all of you would take advantage of the resources here. Invite families to be part of this community. If their mental health struggles have gotten in the way of them being part of church, allow them to be introduced to Jesus, and allow them to be in a place where they can grow in their faith and to use their gifts and talents to be able to help build up this church and to serve other people and to honor God. So at this point, I know that was a lot of stuff. I'm going to stop, and I think we have question cards. I believe we had cards or something for anybody who does have questions after all of that. Sorry about the time. There's been a few times I've been invited to guest preach, and I know that the one rule in church is never surprise the children's ministry people by going over. And so I apologize, but there's a lot of stuff here, and I took a little latitude tonight. Are there any questions? Can't believe we answered everything. Well, if there aren't any, and again, we wanted to let you write down questions, because I know that the large segment of the adult population with social anxiety would be uncomfortable asking them in a group setting, and we want to be inclusive. I'm happy to hang around for a little while. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the work that we've done at Key Ministry, that we have a nationally renowned disability ministry, but a lot of people don't realize that there's a little organization that was birthed out of here that actually hosts the largest disability ministry conference in the United States. And so, and that was all doing with people from this church. So we can talk to you a little bit about that, answer any other questions, remind you not to bet on the Browns this weekend or ever, I'd be delighted to meet any of you afterward. I was one of your elders last century if you go here. So, so anyway, thanks to Jenny, thanks to Pastor Grant. Is that a question in the back? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things, I know there's the little track phones and stuff that people will buy. I'm assuming that there's stuff like that you can find online, but the folks at Best Buy or the Verizon store probably aren't going to tell you about it, because they want to sell you a more expensive phone and a data plan. Carmen. Well, how old's your kid? Well, I think it depends a lot on the age of the child. I mean, and that you need to be aware of like what they're looking at, because like there are too many parents that just hand their kids the iPad and like walk away because they're too busy scrolling on their own devices. And so that, I think it's, it's fine to give kids some choice. But again, I think that not at the expense of having the opportunity to be able to interact with other kids. And the older they get, the more nefarious kinds of things that they can stumble upon online. And so that you need to be, sort of like physically present and engaged enough to have an awareness of what they're watching. Again, YouTube videos that are maybe like longer form are probably less detrimental than these brief TikTok videos that are, created and pushed out through the algorithm, as a way of trying to keep kids engaged on the platform. So probably longer form stuff as opposed to shorter form stuff, but all of it age appropriate and all of it done like within the presence of the parents. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Bay Press for hosting, and I'm happy to hang around for a while and answer questions. So thanks for coming out tonight.